Okay, I think we are live. I want to chat hosted by the Independent Women's Forum. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about Earth Day and issues that are relevant to the environmental policy and the energy policy space. Both very important issues when we're thinking about what we're going to be doing tomorrow and celebrating Earth Day. And to have these conversations, I've brought two of the foremost experts on these issues and women that I have worked with in a number of capacities. I have such immense respect, and I'm grateful y'all are here with me today to help me with the conversation. First is Gabriella Hoffman. She is an IWF Senior Fellow and the co-director for our new Center for Energy and Conservation. And she is also a freelance media consultant, a columnist, a podcast. It's the District of Conservation. I highly recommend you guys check it out. And she's also an award-winning outdoor writer. So she is a thinker and a creative and a very smart policy person on all of these issues. And also joining me is my former colleague from our administration days, but she's since moved on to the American Exploration and Petroleum Council. Did I get that right, Liz?
No, but it's funny because people often don't, so it's okay.
Okay. So AXPC, as we call it, I'll let Liz tell me what the AXPNC actually are. But Liz Bowman is here with us. She leads their strategic communications, messaging, and media relations for AXPC. She joined from the American Petroleum Institute, where she was head of communications and marketing. She worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She also worked in the U.S. Senate and has a plethora of experience on all of these issues from an administrative regulatory perspective, as well as working legislatively and then off the Hill, representing various associations. So Liz, welcome, and please tell us all, what does AXPC actually stand for?
Sure. So AXPC is the American Exploration and Production Council, and we represent the American independent producers of oil and natural gas. And independents produce 89% of our oil and 92% of our natural gas onshore in the United States. So we are really important to our energy security, as well as our lower prices and the United States climate leadership, which I know is going to be a topic of discussion today. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate the importance of the folks that Liz represents through her work at AXPC, they're more of your mid-size and smaller size companies that are in the exploration and production aspect. You don't always hear about them in the media, the large corporations like you do, a Shell or Exxon and their derivatives, but they are the ones who are out in the field extracting the resources. They are the complete pros and the ones that literally put their blood, sweat, and tears into delivering the energy resources we use all the time, every day, we take for granted. And because they do it here in the United States, they do it consistent with the gold standard of environmental protections and are very attuned and always trying to innovate to improve in that space. Now, before we get into a little bit more of the specifics of what else is going on in the industry, Liz, I do want to tee it up with Gabby, because you've written a ton about the positive story that we in the United States have when it comes to environmentalism and conservation. It's not necessarily something that is always discussed, because it turns out fear and anxiety gets a lot more clicks in this space than talking about the true state of environmentalism. So could you just read us into what is the status of the U.S. environment and how far we've actually come?
I would like to tell everyone watching that there's actually much to celebrate and rejoice over American environmentalism as it stands today. And when I'm writing stuff for IW, whether it is blog format or in op-ed format or giving lectures across the country, I talk about true conservation being kind of this gold standard of environmentalism and kind of the positive way to view environmentalism, a philosophy that's worked for a long time. And overall, we are enjoying, even with imperfect public policy and regulators who are not adhering to conservation practices as best as they can, we are still probably one of the cleanest countries in terms of our air quality, our water quality. We have so much biodiversity. I cannot tell you, even anecdotally, how many different kinds of wildlife I see in my backyard, in my travels, flora, fauna, species that used to be endangered that are now fully recovered, bald eagles, black bears, grizzly bears. So with all that we have, since we're a very economically advanced country, having that coupled with this prioritization of natural resources management that is responsibly stewarded, coupled with the fact that we have so much wildlife, we have sacred spaces, we have national parks, we have millions upon millions of acres of public lands. We're able to do all of this, all the while obviously maintaining a strong economy for the most part. And we don't hear this often enough. We often hear about that the United States is the worst actor out there when it comes to the environment. We have the most egregious practices. Yet when our record is stood and contrasted with much of the world, we are arguably the leader here. And so I think people don't look very carefully here at home and appreciate what we have here, the standards we have here, and this balanced use approach that we really hold ourselves to. And so it's easy to complain about the United States, about our practices, but we're far better off compared to the rest of the world. And I think they have some shaping up to do, not us.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I would just throw in a few stats. Liz is going to be very familiar with these statistics, but there's a couple ways that the United States measures its environmental progress, and that's by air quality, access to clean drinking water, cleanup of legacy pollution, then also the reduction of greenhouse gases, which is an indicator alongside economic growth. So there's a split indicator there that's really important. But first, when it comes to air quality, we in the United States continue to breathe the cleanest air on record. We've reduced since 1970 overall air emissions by 78%. This is amazing and something that should be known and appreciated and to be protected, but something to be appreciated. When it comes to clean drinking water, we have massively improved the amount of people who have access to clean, reliable drinking water. Again, in the 70s, when a lot of these standards started being measured from the US EPA's perspective, only 40% of communities had access to water that met low health standards. Today, I believe that number is closer to 60 or 70%. Liz, I don't know why I'm blanking on that. 60 or 70% of communities have access to water that meets the highest health standards. So we've made massive improvement, including cleaning up legacy pollution. And then we lead the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the key to that is the oil and gas industry. So Liz, let me tee it over to you to either add a few more statistics. I know you worked a lot on this when we were at the US EPA, constantly under the gun about the type of approach we took. But we have really good data points to back it up. And then tell us about the role of US oil and gas in this positive environmental story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, between 2005 and 2020, the United States emissions decreased by 23% because of the switch from coal to natural gas. And that's really where our member companies and the shale revolution comes in. And I think that that's one of the most positive environmental stories that the world really has to tell, which is the story of the American shale revolution. So the United States is the top producer in oil. We are also the top producer in natural gas. And now we are the leading exporter of US LNG. All of these are fairly new stories because in the early 2000s, United States oil and natural gas production was declining. Our access to affordable and reliable energy was dependent on foreign sources. But because of our energy companies, American entrepreneurship, free markets, and innovation, the stuff that IWF talks about a lot, something uniquely American happened, which was the American shale revolution. So by combining these technologies in America of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, we unlocked these vast amounts of oil and natural gas from basins around the country. And this clean American energy became the feedstock for the historic economic growth that we've seen in this country. It brought our manufacturing jobs back home. It lifted millions of people out of poverty around the globe. And the American shale revolution is really the reason why we lead the world in emissions reductions, as natural gas has replaced higher emitting sources of energy. And now we also aren't relying on those foreign producers. The other thing that you mentioned when Gabby was talking about other countries and how the United States does it better, I do want to call out the fact that the United States is currently responsible for about 13% of global CO2 emissions, and that number continues to fall because of the innovations of the private sector, while China is responsible for 31% of emissions, and that number is only growing. And so when we talk about leadership, the United States really is the leader in environmental protection, on the climate space, but also across the other areas you mentioned as well.
Yeah, and a leader in ways that matter, just not by rhetoric and headlines and new ideas that aren't really rooted in reality, but with tangible metrics that have a meaningful impact on people's lives. Liz, you brought up the something I think is really important, and let us know if this has shifted recently or if it could shift under the Biden administration's current policies, where they are trying to suppress the development of oil and gas here in the United States, which has the effect of making us more reliant on those foreign producers that our innovators worked so hard to get us free from in the early 2010s, and then we reaped the benefits of in the earlier days of the last administration. So could you just talk about what are some of the policies that are currently being pushed under the Biden administration that stands to undermine energy independence and the relative environmental benefits that have been achieved through that in recent years?
Absolutely. I mean, since day one, the Biden administration has been pursuing policies that have contributed to high prices. It's hurting our energy security and it's hurting our climate leadership. They discourage investment in oil and natural gas. They layer dozens of costly new regulations on burdensome rules on American energy producers. They cancel pipelines, and they've essentially halted all leasing on federal lands. These are all policies that individually are problematic, but they are continuing to suppress production, which is hurting all of the things that I mentioned. And so it's really important to kind of look at these policies individually, but also as a whole, and see how they're hurting our country. And specifically, I mean, just last week, it's Mandy, I'm sure you're familiar with, they released the new EPA, released their new tailpipe rule, which is basically forcing people into more expensive cars that they don't want, and it's trying to transition into new electric vehicles. I mean, which is completely not only legally and economically dubious, but it also creates a situation where it's just impractical. I mean, they're trying to push, I think, 66% of vehicles to be electric in the next 10 years. And you compare that to reality, where last year only 6% of vehicles were electric. I mean, these are just not serious proposals for moving us forward. And when you put out something that unrealistic, it has almost the opposite effect, and it does not move us forward. It's also reducing demand. It's affecting consumer choice and freedom. And those are really serious issues because of these aggressive and costly and burdensome proposals coming out of the administration.
Well, it seems to me, Liz, that they're using the role of the federal government, the regulatory state, as a tool to go after industries instead of doing what we know the missions are. It's not to suppress economic development or industrial activity. It's to keep it going, but make sure it's being done in a clean, efficient way, consistent or cognizant of cost and consistent with what actual technologies can achieve today. Another tool, this is also being deployed, though, not just in the EPA space. Gabby, I'll bring you in. It's also being deployed through the Department of Interior. And what's fighting out is this difference in approach to lands management, one rooted in conservation and the other one rooted in preservation. Could you define that landscape for a little bit and talk about a few of the policies?
Yes. And we'll talk more so also about other ways that they're deviating the the departments from their intended purposes. Interior and Fish and Wildlife Service and others are not immune to being captured by causes other than what their mission statements are. But more specifically to your question is there's a new lands rule, which is actually not very different from a previous rule that was considered under the Obama administration. Some of our viewers and listeners may be familiar with BLM Planning Rule 2.0. And that was a rule to basically say that multiple use is an outdated model with respect to prioritizing energy development, especially of conventional energy sources. So we need to, in essence, prioritize so-called conservation uses. And that didn't sit well with a lot of members of Congress. And they said that it would actually not only affect commercial uses on public lands, but also even impact recreational purposes to go fishing, hunting, camping, hiking. So under the guise of conservation, they were advancing preservation. The former president essentially killed that rule, and Congress voted using the Congressional Review Act to prevent that rule from happening again. And they're deliberating a similar rule And off of the stipulations of the previous rule that was defeated, they can't exactly be deliberating the same rule. That's what the conditions of that revoking of the rule said. So there is some legal questions about whether or not they could pursue this new public lands rule, which claims to prioritize conservation leases. But I was looking at the rule proposal, and it borrows a lot of language from the Aspen Institute and these other advocacy groups that are calling for a moving away from multiple use to what is being billed as a public use. But it's really not a public use model when it creates no touching, no access, views human impact as a negative type of concept. And so we're seeing conservation in the traditional sense being undermined with proposals that are being touted as conservation, but are far and away from being conservation minded. And so it doesn't just impact energy development, it also has downstream effects on your ability to hunt and fish, to graze, to run different operations that border, private and public lands, essentially, which is how a lot of these landowners are able to graze their cattle, to have timber operations, what have you. And so Western stakeholders, people, especially outside of the Beltway, are very concerned that these rules are twisting what conservation is and removing them from the processes of deliberation, stakeholder input and whatnot, and giving preference to environmental interests, preservationist interests that are largely propping up this administration or getting the administration to change what conservation means, Sierra Club types and the like. And so we're seeing a lot of that kind of abuse of what conservation is under the umbrella of preservation, and they're very successful in billing it as something that is, traditionally viewed as conservation, but they're working to undermine the true conservation model, unfortunately, and we're seeing that through this proposal and many other ways as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Gabby. The left is very good at taking words that have meaning or institutions that have respect and purpose, and then co-opting them to achieve their goals. I do want to shift a little bit though to more of the okay. So what are we going to do about it? Let's shift to the positive side. And Liz, I'd ask you. I know in Capitol Hill there was the recent passage of HR1. The Lower Energy for Americans Act. I may have said that wrong too, but that's essentially the title. And it was just passed in the House. I imagine AXPC cared a lot about that. Could you talk about either that piece of legislation or other initiatives that are in front of policymakers that could actually make a difference in unleashing the types of energy we need, certainly oil, gas, coal, nuclear as base load, but also other types. But just read us into what y'all are really focusing on and what could make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did support HR1, which because we thought it was thoughtfully crafted to unleash American energy, as you mentioned, and lower energy costs by monitoring the permitting process, providing greater clarity on infrastructure projects, streamlining other issues, and requiring DOI to resume their quarterly lease sales on federal lands. There were all these bills throughout HR1 that really went to kind of improve the processes and the procedures that are happening right now to further American energy production, and also to roll back a lot of the burden policies that have been put in place by the Biden administration. So one of the things in HR1 was repealing the new natural gas tax that went in as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is something that's going to raise Americans' home heating costs. And then a lot of the other policies that were put in place under the IRA are policies that really increase the cost that Americans are paying for all of their energy. And Americans over the past couple of years have been crushed by the effects of inflation. And when the cost of energy go up, it just exacerbates the cost that everyone is paying for everything else, from groceries to gasoline to their home heating costs. And so some of the bills that have been presented through HR1 by the House Republicans are really trying to tackle these issues head on and get us back to a place of practical solutions to unleashing our American energy.
That makes so much sense. And it's frustrating to see the administration take this position that you have to pit the environmental health and progress against energy. And when they take that approach, it's we, the consumers, that have to deal with the consequences. Could you read us into, though, how, and you just highlighted that with inflation and grocery stores, but it's often said that high cost energy affects vulnerable communities the most. Could you read us in a little bit to that?
Well, absolutely. When the cost of energy goes up, I mean, you're looking at higher home heating costs, you're looking at high gasoline, and those are disproportionately burdened by the people on the lower ends of the economic scale. So when they have to spend more of their their take-home pay to pay for their energy bills, I mean, it's going to hurt them, and they're going to have to cut back in other areas. I know there's many polls, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, where there's significant numbers of Americans who have said that they were facing forms of energy insecurity during the pandemic, where the cost of everything have gone up, and they've gone up over the past few years. And that is an inflationary pressure that all Americans are facing, and it's something that needs to be addressed. So the best way to bring those costs down is to start tackling where it's coming from, to make sure that we are able to produce energy here in the United States, to make sure that we have the supplies that we need to reduce those costs. Because when there's a gap between the demand and the supply, that's when these costs go up. And as we came out of the pandemic and the world opened back up very quickly, it takes a while to build back up that supply. So the production of oil and natural gas is not something you can turn on with the flip of a switch. It requires thoughtful years of planning, environmental analysis, community involvement, and it's something that needs to happen over time. And so we have to plan for those things, and we need regulatory certainty in order to be able to make that happen. And when the administration is putting policies in place that are suppressing the supply or causing more expensive regulations, is something that overall hurts energy costs. The other thing that we haven't mentioned is that a lot of the policies that were put in place by the Biden administration are actually going to cost so much money that it hurts the ability for companies to invest in these new technologies that further reduce emissions and better protect the environment. So it actually is having a counterproductive, it's counterproductive to what the administration is actually claiming that they want to do.
Yeah, and I think, Liz, it's not just what they're using through their regulatory might. And Gabriella, I'll pitch this over to you. Another trend we've seen in the financial sector, it's referred to as environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investing. From IW's perspective, we've written a lot about this. This is nothing more than an abuse of financial crediting and scoring for purposes of pushing a woke agenda. Writ large in the energy space, it's pushing this net zero policy that isn't realistic. It stands to cause all the harm that you just laid out, Liz, and then also undermine environmental progress. So, Gabriella, let me just pitch it over to you a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about ESG and why this is a problem, especially when it comes to continuing environmental progress we've experienced over the past few decades.
As Liz articulated very well, energy inflation is probably one of the biggest increases in costs that people have seen. Regular consumers have been burdened by increased prices at the pump. Utility bills are up. And for a time, it was almost like 100% increase in cost. I think we were putting out in our various different news items and scholarship, op-eds that we had worked together on, op-eds that I have done on ESG. We had found that energy inflation, or enflation, is largely being brought about by the E-prong, the environmental prong of ESG. And ESG, as we were talking before going live, has kind of morphed into this all-encompassing political philosophy, not just something exclusive to investments, but it starts in the private sector under the guise of, we're protecting the environment, we're promoting sustainability, and then it's a gesture to the federal government. The Biden administration has basically dictated that throughout its energy and climate policy is going to be implementing and streamlining ESG in all these related areas. So ESG is nominally and even directly spelled out in all these different initiatives to go net zero, to get rid of gas-powered cars, to move away from oil, coal, and gas, to prioritize, things that are not as stable for the electric grid and whatnot, and even, changing behaviors elsewhere, environmentally speaking. And so the E-prong continues to be very problematic. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is really arguably a climate bill, really is going to be perpetuating this. And we're coming into the summer months. People are going to see more at the pump. Your heating and home bills are going to continue to go up. You're just going to, and then obviously they're exhausting the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they have no intent of replenishing it, even though it's like a last resort type of reserve and supply. And like Liz mentioned, and you as well, Mandy, that they don't want to explore safely here. I think for one of our recent fact checks, I was able to conclude that there was a 5% decrease of available leases being used that are open to usage, but that are not being tapped into largely because of these policies that are discouraging investment in federal lands, offshore and onshore federal land, oil and gas development, because they've increased the royalty rates and so much more. And yes, so we are feeling the impacts of ESG, especially as realized in the E prong, similarly with the S prong too, because they're saying that, and there's a lot of overlap between it. And then the companies with the G prong, the governance prong, are saying, if we're not meeting our sustainability goals, if our board is not reflecting these sustainability goals, we're not doing our job. There's a lot of question over whether or not they can fully, adhere to this, because ESG scores can be very compromised. A corporation can easily purchase. We've noted this at the IW blog very in detail, that companies sometimes pay as high as $500,000 to obtain really good ESG scores. So they can game the system. They can manipulate exactly what their sustainability programs are. They could say they're sustainable here, but in practice, they're actually not adhering to clean environmental standards whatsoever, but they're just trying to go along with it to absolve themselves from any wrongdoing that may be incurred from not adhering to ESG. It's a very, sophisticated pressure campaign.
Right.
And so ESG outside of investment is going to be felt elsewhere. We're all feeling essentially the impacts of ESG through something as simple as noticing a rate hike, like I said, with our energy and our gas bills. So it's very pervasive, and it's going to be felt by everyone outside of the corporate boardroom. So it's something to be aware of, and we're documenting it very closely at IW.
Yeah, and you've been doing a great job just staying on top of the state response. The states are really starting to push back, especially at the attorney general level, where they are obviously looking out for their state's interest and calling out this growing trend in the corporate world, but the integration of it by the federal government that is an abuse of authority and really causing harm and deterring investment in the very energy resources we not only need more of, but we know how to produce in a very environmentally friendly way. So stands to undermine a lot of the environmental progress. So we are quickly running out of time, but there's two more questions I have. I do want to end on telling our listeners what they can do to celebrate Earth Day in a tangible way beyond listening in and educating themselves on the real story about America's environment and the role of our advanced energy systems. But right before I do that, Liz, I want to ask you, we are the Independent Women's Forum, and I often like to highlight the role of women in these industries that have the stereotype, whether right or wrong, of being a so-called man's world. Could you talk a little bit about the women in the industry, the ones that you work with, what's their relative role, and just any of the listeners who may be interested to let them know, hey, if you're interested in this space, there's probably an opportunity for you if you're willing to work for it.
Absolutely. I mean, energy issues are important to everybody, and they are women's issues as well. Where I work at AXPC, we, of our staff of 6, we are 5 out of 6 women. Our CEO is a woman. Our head of regulatory affairs is a woman. I'm a woman, as well as we have 2 other women that work here. And I don't really think about it as a gender specific issue. And I try not to think about things as in that context, but I do think that it's really important to encourage people and women who are interested in energy to put themselves forward, to get interested in the issues, to learn more about it. This is a very important topic, and it's something that we need to make sure that individuals are aware of and that they can learn where energy resources come from. We recently did a poll to kind of get a sense of where people in DC and in the policymaker space feel about energy and gas issues. And we noticed that there was actually a big gender gap with regard to women. And we have realized that this is really an area that we need to educate and inform people on, because I think that when women in particular have the facts about the role that oil and natural gas play in our economy and our everyday lives and keeping our country safe and our energy prices low, I think that we can further support the issue, and I think they can understand where we're coming from and hopefully be advocates for the American energy revolution. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in these issues to reach out and find ways to participate. And the other thing that I know women and all the women I know are very involved in their communities, and oil and gas companies are extremely community minded. They are some of the biggest supporters of community investments. They get in there, they volunteer, especially in the companies in the places where they live and operate. And so I think that that is something that women can be drawn to, is the really civic minded organizations that come with working for an oil and gas company.
Yeah, I think That's well said and well put. And they're such important investors. I mean, you see who sponsors the my community. We have these amazing ball fields: soccer, baseball, softball, field hockey, lacrosse. And it's, if you look around, it's sponsored by the local gas stations, or even a couple of energy interests. And so they have a huge part in investing in things that make such a big difference in that local community experience. Okay, I do want to close on what are one or two things that you would tell our listeners that they could do to celebrate Earth Day tomorrow. Gabby?
Sure. Well, if you are in a state where there is active fishing and hunting opportunities, we're right now in turkey season, with it being spring. We're also in the midst, towards the conclusion of trout season, but you can basically fish for most species now, freshwater and even saltwater if you're on the coast. But I would say buying a fishing or hunting license goes back to conservation through the Pittman-Robertson Act. You're supporting conservation funding by doing that. It's also a great time. And even if you're not catching something or harvesting anything, you may see something in the wild. You're spending time in nature. You're surrounded by green spaces. Maybe you're close by water. Very good to put your mind at ease in those ways. You could support conservation organizations that you know are putting your money and donations to good use. There are a lot of even private outlets. Something I profiled for one of our policy focuses early on, before even we launched our center, when I was first starting here as a fellow. There's a group called 4Oceans. They're private, and they are helping to reduce plastic pollution in oceans around the world. And they're not really doing anything questionable from my understanding. And I think they're genuine and sincere, and they're using the purse of, private sector to accomplish their goals. There's a lot of different things out there. Private companies, look to the companies that are sincere, not really leaning on ESG to tell them how to be sustainable. And there are a lot of private companies that do have a vested interest in conservation, even outside of supporting their local communities, which is applaudable and great. But look to the companies that do kind of relate to conservation. Toyota is, if you're a Toyota buyer, Toyota hasn't fully gone crazy on EV, let's say scalability yet, because they're more practical. But one of my friends there told me that they're helping to rehabilitate the bison population, and they're really big on conservation. They're promoting things, like I said, without really being forced to do it by ESG means. So look to companies that are genuine, sincere. You yourself, you can plant a tree. That's always great because it absorbs carbon, what have you. That's something as simple, just going for a hike, going outdoors, spending time outdoors away from the concrete jungle with your family, with your friends. It should be a beautiful weekend, and that's how you best do it, instead of fear-mongering and scaring people about the economy being a factor into the environment's demise and what have you. You can be positive, and you can counteract that kind of negative message by spending time outdoors, breathing in fresh air, and just enjoying what we have here, because we're very fortunate with private and public lands, just the different offerings here, and we have much to celebrate on Earth Day.
Yeah, that's right. All right, Liz, either tell us what you're going to be doing to celebrate, or if you have any advice for our listeners, what they could do.
Well, I feel like that was a very comprehensive answer, and I can't really, I don't really want to follow that one. But I was just going to say to go outside and enjoy being outside with your family and your friends, go for a walk, visit a public park. They're all over in every state, in every community. There is a local public park that you can visit to just enjoy being outside and being with the people that you love. So that's what I would say.
I think that's wonderful, and a great way to wrap up this awesome conversation. I hope our listeners have found it very enlightening. I would add that folks still can go outside and pick up trash off the side of the road. Those little things do still matter, even though they don't necessarily make the headlines like they once did. And the other piece I would suggest is checking out all of our work at iwf.org. And especially check out, Gabby, was it last year that you wrote Policy Focus on the true story of conservation and environmentalism? I would encourage you to go check that out. And Liz, where can folks find information about AXPC and or follow you?
It's really easy, axpc.org. That's our website. And there you can follow us. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And so hopefully there's some information there that will help you and teach you more about the importance of the oil and natural gas industry and what we're doing to support the world's climate leadership and environmental protection.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Thank you both. Gabby, did you want to add anything else? There's a lot of ways for folks to follow you. Obviously, you work at iwf.org, but tell other ways?
Yeah, it's all listed on the website, on IW's website. But if you're interested, I've had Mandy come on my podcast to talk about all things related to IW, her past work at EPA, what we're doing at the CEC. But my podcast, District of Conservation, is a great way to connect. And I'll leave it at that because there's too much to list. But I think that's the best channel also to kind of see how we communicate CEC through different portals, even outside of the website and the organization.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, Liz, for your time, for joining us. Thank you to our listeners. Please let us know if you like this. If you have any other questions, feel free to share with your friends and community. And with that, we wish you all a very happy, healthy Earth Day.